Hey folks, welcome back to the second lecture of the week, where we are going to continue where we left off last time, which was with the outbreak of the Civil War. Last time I traced for you the argument that slavery must be understood as the central and underlying cause of the war, and that while things like states' rights, for example, those are real concepts that engendered real debates. That if you want to understand the Civil War that killed over 600,000 Americans, you have to grapple with the central role of slavery in our conflict. I ran through for you the 10 years roughly leading up to the war, and we ended here in April of 1861 with a Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, which is what actually kicked off the war itself. And what I want to do today is talk for you a little bit about the conduct of the war itself and why it ended up the way it did, why the North ended up winning the war. We're going to again revisit this notion of contingency, that if the military leaders of the South had pursued perhaps a different strategy, or if a handful of battles had gone the other way, this conflict and the rest of American history could have turned out quite different. Now, on paper, this war, once it actually broke out, looked tremendously unbalanced, right? I've showed you this graph when I talked about the antebellum South, and I noted for you that while the South in the decades leading up to the Civil War was quite wealthy as a result of the export of cotton, it was what we would today call an underdeveloped country, particularly compared to their cousins in the North. By just about every measure, the North started this conflict in a superior position, right? So, population, for example, which is not trivial when you're thinking about fielding an army. The North has a population of 22 million, more than twice that of the South. And of the South, 9 million people, 4 million of whom are enslaved people who you are obviously not going to trust with arms. And in fact, you need to be careful of at all times, the least they join the North in trying to overthrow your government. This disadvantage in population, uh, of course, spills directly over onto the battlefield. By the end of the war, the North had managed to equip and field 2 million men under arms, while the South had managed less than half that number. And of course, it's not just men in uniform that determine battles, particularly once we get to the industrial era, right? Warfare in the industrial age, and by the 1860s, we are firmly in the industrial age, is determined as much by how many guns and how much equipment and ammunition you can produce, and also how quickly you can transport them and then the men who are carrying them to the places where they need to be, right? So the North has 80% of the nation's factories, 2/3 of its railroads. And a non-trivial fact, if you're fighting a war, is that in 1861, the North had 97% of the nation's gun manufacturer. So, in short, the South at the start of this conflict was outgunned, outmanned, and outsupplied. Moreover, the South itself was hampered from the very beginning by its own ideological and political underpinnings. As much as I stressed for you that states' rights was not actually the underlying conflict of the war, right? It was the right to own Black people as property. It is true that Southerners had a genuine belief in limited government and states' rights. This is a fact that makes it maybe a little easier to think about seceding from the Union, but it's also a serious pain in the ass when it comes to fighting a war. Many white Southerners had views about economics and government that would be today described as libertarian, right? Government hands off. Whatever you think about those views in the abstract, I have my own opinions. I'm sure you have yours. You could probably guess what mine are. But whatever you think of them in the abstract, they make it really hard to organize a war, right? So, in the North, for example, where centralized government isn't as big of an issue, the North simply increased taxes and tariffs in order to pay for the war, right? If you're fighting a war, you got to increase taxes to pay for the war. Up until 1863, 2 years into the conflict, Southern governors refused to pay taxes, to raise taxes to pay for the war. Um, without taxes to raise money. And even after they raise taxes, it's really not enough to cover the expenses of the war. The Confederate government resorted to simply printing more money, printing new money. This is exactly what the US government did during the Revolutionary War, and the results were exactly the same. By 1865, the Confederacy had a 9,000% inflation rate. The Southern economy was a mess. Its military establishment was a little better. They had a handful of really excellent field commanders in the military, folks like Robert E. Lee, who managed to work wonders with the relatively meager military resources at their disposal. But the South, as a kind of governmental and military and economic entity, was a basket case from the beginning. Moreover, while the Confederates could agree on the need to preserve slavery, this was the fundamental underlying fact that drove the Confederacy. That was basically all the Confederate States could agree on. There's no strong executive. There is a president in the Confederate system, Jefferson Davis. But as you can imagine, the Confederacy devolved a lot of power to the states, and each of the states demanded a substantial amount of autonomy in the way the war effort was run. The Confederacy had a difficult time mobilizing to fight and agreeing on strategy, even in the heady and optimistic early days of the war. This problem only got worse over time as war weariness and battlefield setbacks contributed to dissension and fighting um, among the Confederate governments. In the flush of enthusiasm in the early days of the war, finding soldiers was easy, right? In the early days of the war, there's a lot of enthusiasm in the Confederacy for fighting for the cause, and also an assumption that the war would be over relatively quickly. By 1862, however, it's clear that the fighting is going to go on much, much longer than initially anticipated, and the battle was much, much bloodier. And relatively quickly, enthusiasm for being cannon fodder subsides. And by 1862, a year after the war starts, the Confederacy enacted the first draft in American history. And the idea is compulsory service for all military-age men. However, um, there are exceptions made. So you could avoid serving in the Confederate military either by paying a substitute to take your place, right? So you find somebody else and say, hey, I don't want to serve, I'll pay you, you go serve in my place. Or any white man who owned more than 20 slaves. And the idea here is, oh, well, you're contributing to the war effort by supervising your slave labor camp. The effect, though, is to create resentment among poor non-slaveholding whites who are, of course, unable to buy their way out of the draft and do not own slaves of their own. And the phrase "a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight" becomes a common way to describe this war in the South, right? That it was the great lords of the plantations, the folks who own vast numbers of enslaved people who engineered this war, but it's poor people who fight it and die in it. So in addition to all of the various economic and military disadvantages that they faced, the Confederate leaders had to deal with tensions constantly brewing beneath the surface. By the end of the war, the average white Southerner had become preoccupied simply with staying alive, and most were refusing to pay taxes, provide food, or serve in the army. Right, the Confederacy collapsed from the inside by the end. So, to summarize, the Confederacy was clearly at a disadvantage from the very beginning, up against an adversary with a much more advanced industrial base, much less adverse to the exercise of centralized power, with greater manpower, greater liquid capital. Um, and yet, for all of these disadvantages, the South not only made the decision to go to war, but also managed to hold out for 4 years, inflict grievous casualties on the North, and actually came very, very close to prevailing in the conflict if a few things had broken differently. Why, right? Why is this? Lincoln's explanation for this as to why the war took so long and why it was such a closely fought and precarious victory for the North was just that Northern generals sucked, right? That the North had bad generals and the South had good generals. There's some amount of truth to that, particularly in the early days. Northern generals were not necessarily the sharpest tools in the shed. Um, but in fact, there's actually much more to it than that. In my past life, I actually did a certain amount of military and diplomatic history, and I'm actually kind of shocked that the North was able to win at all, because for all of the challenges that the South faced in persecuting its war effort, the North arguably had a greater set of challenges. First of all, the North suffered from many of the same problems as the South when it came to fighting the war. And arguably, political divisions within the North were just as bad, if not worse, than in the South. From the beginning of the war, Lincoln faces problems on both his left and his right flank. The more radical members of his party were immediately pressuring him to not simply smash the Confederacy, but to emancipate all of the enslaved people. Meanwhile, on his right flank, Northern Democrats, folks who had been members of the Democratic Party, but ultimately favored section, the North, over party, the Democrats, um, nominally supported Lincoln, but were also still closely tied to their brethren in the South, and were from the very beginning arguing for a negotiated peace, saying, "Hey, let's not fight this war. Let's just negotiate with the South." So you have folks. He has folks on his left flank pressing for a more aggressive war effort and immediate emancipation. Folks on his right pressing for immediate peace and are not at all interested in emancipation. In 1864, Lincoln faced the unenviable job of running against one of his own former military commanders, a guy named General George McClellan. McClellan was a war hero who ran against Lincoln in 1864 on a platform of peace. McClellan says, "Hey, this war has gone badly. Lincoln's bungled it. We shouldn't even be fighting. Elect me, a general who has all the kind of credibility in the world when it comes to military matters. Elect me, and I will make peace and end this war." Lincoln was absolutely certain that he was going to lose. Um, the war, when the election starts in 1864, appears to be hopelessly deadlocked. McClellan is promising peace. Um, Lincoln is absolutely sure he's going to lose. And even when dramatic news of Union victories in the months leading up to the election eventually helped push him to victory, it's very close, right? So this is the election of 1864, and it's only held in the North and the West, right? The Confederate States are not voting. And if you look just to the Electoral College, which for Lincoln is in red, it looks like this looks like a blowout, which it was in terms of the electoral vote. But look at that popular vote, right? 45% of people in the North voted against Lincoln. And again, we sort of think of Lincoln as this towering figure in American history. He's a kind of bipartisan figure. The Republican Party claims him, but Democrats also love him. Um, Routinely ranked as the number one president in U.S. history. 45% of Northerners voted against him in the election of 1865 in the middle of the war. That gives you some indication of the challenges that Lincoln faced, just holding on to power politically, much less winning the war. Now, in addition to all of these political problems, the industrial and military superiority of the North um, isn't necessarily all it was cracked up to be, right? On paper, this looks like a tremendous disadvantage, which it was. Um, but at the start of the war, when the war begins in 1861, the Union Army only had 16,000 men in it. Now, most of those folks had very little military experience. And as you'll recall, the last time we saw the Union Army in action, or the then US Army in action, they weren't in the world's greatest shape, right? The war with Mexico revealed deep divisions within the ranks of the US Army, divisions that were so deep that some US soldiers defected and actually fought for the Mexican side. There was nothing that had happened in the intervening 20 years or so that had really changed the fundamental class, ethnic, and religious dynamics within the United States to paper over those divisions. So you have a relatively small Union army that suffers from the same kind of divisions, or divisions of ethnicity, divisions of religion, divisions of class, that had helped cripple it during the war with Mexico. These tensions within the Union Army were exacerbated by a similar kind of draft policy as we saw in the South, right? So um, by 1863, the Union Army has also essentially run out of volunteers to throw into the meat grinder. And the United States also enacts a draft. Much like the Confederate version, though, you could get out of the draft by either finding somebody who will serve in your place, or by paying the US government, saying, hey, like, I don't want to serve, but I'm gonna just give you cash, right? How about you take these Ben Franklins instead of my body? Um, so you pay $300, which is the equivalent, if you were to put that into $20 of, a little over $6,000. Um, and so again, as in the North, while it may be a rich man's war, right? While it may be the folks who are leading this war effort and calling the shots are wealthy, increasingly the folks who are fighting and dying for the Union cause as the Confederate cause tend to be the poor and recent immigrants, right? Folks who can't come up with $300 to get out of serving in the army. Most dramatic example of the tensions over this occurred in New York City in July of 1863, where we had the so-called New York City draft riots. These riots had their roots in working class sections of New York, particularly among poor Irish immigrants, who were resentful not only of the draft, but also of the whole kind of stew of urban, ethnic, and religious tensions that had been brewing in American cities during the previous 20 years, right? And we saw some of those in play during the Astor Place riots. It took the arrival of federal troops, so the US Army has to come to New York City fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg. So the Union wins the Battle of Gettysburg and then has to fight poor New Yorkers in the streets of New York City to put down this riot. Right. So the North faces its own set of internal problems that hampered its war effort and undercut its theoretical military and economic superiority over the South. Perhaps even more importantly, the very nature of this conflict fundamentally favored the South. When you think about the sort of the war aims and strategy, what each side was trying to achieve in this conflict, the South had a fundamentally much easier task than the North. The South is fighting a defensive war. They weren't trying to take and hold territory. They weren't trying to, march on the North and conquer all of the North. All they needed to do was hold out until the North got tired, right? Protect what they had to defend the South, and just wait till the North got tired and went home. The South wanted to leave the Union. The North had a much more difficult task, which was not simply to defeat the South militarily on the battlefield, but to pacify the entire region and to bring them back into the Union, essentially against the will of white Southerners. To do so, Northern leaders had to sustain military operations over an area comparable in size to the part of Russia that Napoleon had invaded back in 1812 with disastrous results, right? So the North has to not simply win battles, it has to pacify the entire South. Think of the trouble that the British Army, at the time the world's greatest fighting force, had in trying to subdue the Americans during the Revolutionary War. Think of all the trouble the United States Army had in subduing the Mexican Army in the 1840s, an army that was largely composed of folks who had involuntarily been pressed into service. Think of the trouble that the United States has experienced in Iraq, continues to experience in Afghanistan, a war that's been going on since 2001. Now imagine the task that the Union Army faces in fighting on a much, much larger battlefield against a committed and fanatical opponent who knew your tactics inside and out because their military leaders had been to your military academies. And not only that, but at the start of the war, the South arguably had the better set of officers. So the task facing the North of forcing the South to capitulate and return to the Union is a much higher order of difficulty than that faced by the South, which simply needs to wait until the North gets tired and gives up. Not only that, but the advances in military technology between the Mexican War and the Civil War tended to favor the defender. Things like the Springfield rifle, the Gatling gun, meant that a well-positioned defender could simply hide behind a stone wall and pick off attackers from long distances. So the lesson that the North learned, or arguably didn't learn, the hard way in the early years of the war, where the North would mount these attacks against Southern positions and just get mowed down. Moreover, the rudimentary level of modern, as it was, medicine in 1861 meant that almost any kind of injury could be fatal or at least result in amputations. So the South essentially has a relatively clear set of war aims. If your goal is simply to make your opponent give up and leave you alone, and if the war is to be fought on your home ground, then the textbook strategy is to hunker down and fight a defensive war. If the South had employed a truly defensive military strategy, one modeled in many ways on the conduct of American forces during the Revolutionary War, then the North would have faced an incredibly difficult, if not impossible, task. Right? Much as the British during their Southern nightmare in the Revolutionary War, the Union could have won virtually every battle, but found themselves unable to pacify the South as the Confederates engaged in hit and run attacks and gradually sapped Northern morale and increased the chances of a negotiated peace. Ultimately, however, the South does not pursue this strategy. And the South loses the war. The Confederacy loses the war because although they may have had solid military leadership at the tactical level, at the strategic level, they did not end up fighting the war in the defensive manner that their war aim should have dictated. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first had to do with public opinion in the South. So winning the kind of long, slow war of attrition that I just outlined for you means that if you're the defender, you don't just march out and meet the enemy as soon as they cross the border, right? Instead, you allow the Union Army to move in and maybe even occupy parts of your territory. And then, in classic guerrilla fashion, you engage in hit and run tactics, you attack supply lines, you slowly wear down the occupying forces, inflicting casualties a little bit at a time here and there, grinding down the morale of the North to fight over a prolonged period of time. Right? That's a classic kind of guerrilla set of guerrilla tactics that you use against a superior foe who is fighting on your home ground. Grind them down slowly. You don't simply meet them on the battlefield. To Southern political leaders, however, this kind of guerrilla warfare strategy was simply unacceptable. To allow the hated Yankees to simply march in and take over Southern territory might have been militarily smart, but it was political suicide. As soon as the war began and Northern troops began moving south, outraged local communities demanded that Confederate troops be sent to throw back the Yankees, right? A broadsheet printed in Tennessee shortly after the war started declared, "To arms! Our Southern soil must be defended. We must not stop to ask who brought about the war, who is at fault, but let us go and do battle." The result was that the Southern military commanders were forced for political reasons to attempt to deal and meet head on virtually every Northern incursion, throwing up essentially a wall around the borders of the South. Problem is that given the relative disadvantage in manpower, that wall is going to be by nature a very thin one that strained the Confederate army to the breaking point, particularly in the West. So the kind of political need to defend Southern soil effectively prevents the Confederate Army from engaging in the more kind of hit and run and guerrilla tactics that were called for by the political situation and military situation they were facing. Another factor preventing the adoption of a kind of purely defensive strategy or a war of attrition had to do with notions of honor and chivalry among the Confederate officer corps. Well, there were some very capable guerrilla fighters on the Confederate side. Um, the kind of leaders of the Confederate officer class, folks like Robert E. Lee and George Pickett, tended to prefer the romantic and dashing cavalry charge on horseback to the less gentlemanly and honorable tactic of the ambush and the hit and ran raid. And probably the best or worst, depending on how you want to look at it, example of this was Pickett's ill-fated charge at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. And I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow history of all of the battles of the Civil War. If you want that, watch that Ken Burns series. But I am going to talk about Gettysburg, both because it's an important turning point in the war, and also because it illustrates in microcosm many of the military challenges that hampered the South in its conduct of the war. So at Gettysburg, Battle of Gettysburg, the Union Army had seized and held the high ground at the outset of the battle. And Union forces are dug in on this high ground. And General Robert E. Lee, who is in command of the Confederate forces there, for the first 2 days of the battle, orders attacks on the Union lines. First tries one flank, then tries the other. In both cases, the Confederates come very, very close to breaking the Union lines, but they fail. And there are heavy casualties on both sides. This brings us to the third day of the battle. It's July. It's brutally hot. Men are passing out from heat stroke. The wells have run dry, and the smell of the dead rotting in the fields is overwhelming. And it is at this moment, on the third day of the battle, that Lee decides to dispatch General Pickett and his force of 15,000 men to mount a dramatic cavalry charge and infantry charge directly at the center of the Union line. It's going to go right up the middle. And he decides to do this because he thinks the Union will not expect him to attack in the center. And they don't, because it's utterly insane. It's uphill for a mile and a half across open wheat fields, no cover, and they're going up against an entrenched enemy dug in behind a stone wall. Pickett and his men, bravely or stupidly, depending on how you want to look at it, charged the center of the Union lines despite these odds. And the result was an utterly predictable failure. Half the men who make the charge end up falling dead or wounded. And the following day, Lee is forced to withdraw. He had lost 17 generals, more than 1/3 of his army. 28,000 Confederate soldiers were killed or wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg illustrates in microcosm why the South lost the war. And it's not just that Lee lost some of his best men in a suicidal charge. The fact was that Gettysburg was arguably a battle that never should have been fought in the first place, right? You probably heard of the Battle of Gettysburg before if just sort of existing ambiently. It's a name you hear. But where it was, right? So if you look at this map, you'll see those sort of three the little red boxes here right above where our face is, and you'll see right below me here is Gettysburg, right? Where is Gettysburg? Well, Gettysburg is located in the state of Pennsylvania. Pop quiz, is Pennsylvania in the South? No, it's not. Pennsylvania in the Confederacy? No, it's not. Gettysburg is in the North. Why is Robert E. Lee? Why are the Confederates fighting a battle in the North, right? Remember, their aim is not to invade and conquer the North. Their aim is simply to tire the North out until they agree to let the Confederates leave. Rather than fighting that kind of a defensive war, Lee is actually invading the North and fighting them on their own territory. Why, right? This is not something that necessarily matches the war aims of the Confederacy. Why? Well, the most important reason related to a third factor that prevented the South from waging the kind of purely defensive war that arguably made the most sense militarily. And that had to do with politics and international diplomacy. From the beginning of the conflict, the diplomatic strategy of the South hinged on securing recognition from foreign governments, particularly Britain and France. Right? They wanted foreign countries to recognize the South as an independent nation, and essentially make it a fait accompli. A recognition would give the Confederate government increased international legitimacy, and it would open the way to profitable trade deals and increase pressure on the North to end the war, right? And the kind of model here is what Ben Franklin did, right? In 1778, arguably the turning point of the Revolutionary War didn't happen on the battlefield. The Battle of Saratoga is quite important. But arguably, it's this treaty, right, where the United States signs an agreement with France in which France recognizes the United States as an independent nation and agrees to come to its aid, that turns the tide in the Revolutionary War. And the South is trying to do something similar, right? They're trying to get recognition from Britain in particular, but also France. Now, much as in the Revolutionary War, European nations are looking on a little bit skeptically. They don't want to back a loser. There's relatively strong anti-slavery sentiment in Britain in particular, and some sort of reluctance to throw in their lot with the Confederates. And so Gettysburg is essentially a gamble by the Confederacy, this invasion of the North, to prove both to the North and to European nations who are watching from afar that the Confederacy is here to stay, right? In the same way that the Battle of Saratoga essentially proved that the Americans could win on the battlefield and convinced kind of reluctant folks who were sitting on the fence to throw in their lot, Gettysburg is also a gamble. It's a gamble to show France and Britain that, look, the Confederacy is here to stay. Not only can we defend ourselves, we can actually take the war to the North. Right? It's much an attempt to win over foreign nations and convince the North of the futility of this war, as it is an attempt to win any one particular battle. Southern leaders lost their gamble at Gettysburg and eventually the war, in no small part because they could not tailor their military strategy to suit their war aims. They ultimately, despite all of the disadvantages that the North had in conducting this conflict, the South was unable to kind of fight the long, grinding war of attrition, hit and run that best suited its war aims. The North, meanwhile, did ultimately find military leaders who knew how to use the particular advantages possessed by the Union. These two guys, Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, represented the future of American warfare. Indeed, in many ways, they came to exemplify what warfare is going to look like in the sort of 100 years or so after the Civil War. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, who assumed command of the Union Army in 1865, was by no means a military genius. Like the Union commanders who had preceded him, Grant suffered more than his share of defeats. Grant had one thing that those who preceded him did not have, though. Grant's one particular and overriding skill, and one that made him perfectly suited to the Union war effort, was that Grant could do the math. And specifically, Grant could do this math. Grant understood that Union Army had a tremendous advantage in manpower, and that's what was going to win the war for them. He put it like this: the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and keep moving. Right? And that's it. That's in like a couple sentences, Grant's strategy. Um, After virtually every battle Grant faces, whether he wins or loses, and he loses as much as he wins in the beginning, after every battle, Grant picked up his troops and he kept advancing south. He understood that in the short term, at least, he could absorb much higher losses than could his counterparts in the south. 18,000 Union casualties at the Battle of the Wilderness. 8,000 casualties at Spotsylvania, 12,000 casualties at the Battle of Cold Harbor. After every one of those, Grant just kept marching. Now, in the long term, that kind of bloodshed is going to be fatal to the Union as well. No army can sustain that level of losses forever. But Grant knew that if he just kept marching, there would be no long term, that he could bleed the South dry before the North would run out of soldiers. Grant could do the that was his particular bit of military genius. Meanwhile, in the Southeast, General William Tecumseh Sherman took advantage of the thinly stretched Confederate lines to drive right into the heart of the Old South. You see here on the map on the left here. There's not a lot of Union troops here in the Southeast. They're all busy fighting Grant in Virginia. And so Sherman takes his troops and he drives right through the heart of Georgia all the way to the coast. And everywhere he goes, he stops, he finds Southern slave labor camps or plantations. He frees all of the enslaved people, and then he burns them to the motherfucking ground. Mary Chestnut, the Southern diarist, declares, "They say no living thing is found in Sherman's track, only chimneys like telephone poles to carry the news of his attack backwards." In fact, Sherman's march through Georgia in 1864 was actually a relatively bloodless campaign compared to the carnage that's being inflicted and absorbed by Grant in Virginia. For the most part, Sherman is targeting property and not people, burning down these plantations and fields. But arguably, this tactic was more effective in bringing an end to the war than Grant's more traditional strategy of wearing down the Confederate army. Because Sherman's assault on the slave labor plantations of the South not only deprived the Confederacy of the resources it needed to keep fighting, right? To keep fighting, the South needed to generate cotton that it could sell to pay for the war effort, right? It needed farms to generate food. Um, the, the plantation economy of the South is vital to the war effort. And your plantation and your fields get burned down, you're not going to be contributing to the war effort. But not only that, though, um, Sherman's march also drove home the message that the thinly stretched Confederate armies could not protect their own white citizens. It's one thing to be sitting on the porch of your plantation and reading that in the newspaper that Grant is defeating Lee somewhere in Virginia. To read in the newspaper that, oh, the Confederacy is losing. It's quite another to have a Yankee general march up to your plantation, burn your house, seize your crops, and free your slaves. That kind of thing tends to be pretty demoralizing for white Southerners. Moreover, wherever they went, the advancing armies under Sherman and Grant were met by thousands and thousands of enslaved peoples who were fleeing their masters. Because at the same time, the Confederacy was meeting military defeat on the battlefield in 1863 onwards, the very underpinnings of its entire economy and society, the system of African slavery, was coming apart. This presented a tremendous opportunity for the North, but it also posed something of a political challenge. The fleeing slaves that greeted advancing Union troops made the issue of slavery and what was to become of slavery as an institution and the enslaved people who lived under it unavoidable for Lincoln and the North. It presented tangible material evidence that the war was, in fact, brought about by the existence of African slavery in the American South. Again, the underlying cause of this war is slavery. But at the beginning of 1861, at the beginning of this war itself, most Northern leaders were reluctant to acknowledge that fact. And for many of them, this reluctance had to do with issues of political expediency. Because if you were if you were to acknowledge that the war is in fact a conflict about slavery, then that would imply you needed to take a position on it, right? If you're a Northern politician, if you're Lincoln or any other Northern politician, and you say, yeah, this war is about slavery, well, okay, then you need to take a position on slavery. This is what this conflict is about. And if you are a Northern politician and the war is about slavery and you have to take a position, the only logical one to take at that point is that of abolition. However, many Northern politicians are reluctant to publicly say that in 1861. Why? Well, issues of race and racism are still very, very strong in the North. And many white Northerners are still at this point reluctant to embrace the idea of shedding white blood in order to end slavery for Black people. It's one thing to go to Northern whites and say, hey, fight and die for the Union, right? There's a kind of attachment to that among white Northerners. Um, but if a politician were to say, go fight and die for Black people, um, most white Northerners are not going to do that. They're not willing to do that. So there's a kind of political reason in the North to couch the struggle as one about union rather than about slavery. Practical military and political concerns also kept Lincoln from contemplating any immediate move to acknowledge the centrality of slavery to the struggle and then to follow up on that with emancipation. And particularly if you look at the so-called border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Now, these are states that are slave states. Slavery is legal in all of these states, but they decide not to join the Confederacy. And Lincoln is terrified that if he is to announce immediate abolition, that these border states will leave the Union and join the Confederacy, which would have been a tremendous blow to the Union war. It's not until September of 1862, with attitude towards slavery changing in the North and the Union at least slightly more secure in its military and political position, that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the document that is scheduled to go into effect in January of 1863 and declared that slaves in areas occupied by the Confederacy were forever free. It also, for the first time, invited African Americans to serve, to enlist in the Union Army. Now, you've probably heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's often sort of hailed as this sort of great moment in the story of American freedom. It's worth noting, though, how fundamentally limited and conservative this document is. And if you look at the wording there, you should immediately see some problems. It says that enslaved people in areas occupied by the Confederacy were forever free. However, it exempts some 275,000 enslaved people who were held in areas occupied by the Union Army in the West, as well as the almost 500,000 enslaved people held in bondage in these border states that are still part of the Union. So it says, in places where we, the Union, control, whether it's occupied territory in the West or the border states, enslaved people still have to be slaves. Um, if you are in an area occupied by the Confederacy, congratulations, you're free. But of course, you can't exactly go take that Emancipation Proclamation to your white master in the South and say, "Let me go." William Seward, the Lincoln's own Secretary of State, put it like this, sort of sarcastically: "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them, and holding them in bondage where we can set them free." This is an incredibly limited document, and it illustrates the very, very slow journey towards abolition, even among Northern politicians, 2 years essentially into the Civil War. However, as limited and conservative as this was in many respects, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the North and the Union now are officially fighting for freedom for African Americans. Right? That is now the avowed war aim. It greatly increased the moral standing of the North in the eyes of the world. And it made it harder for, once you acknowledge the war is about slavery, it does make it harder for places like Britain, um, to then join the side of the South, and because at that point you are formally joining a war in defense of slavery. Probably the most important immediate impact of the Emancipation Proclamation, since it doesn't actually free any slaves, is to open the ranks of the Union Army to African Americans, something that prior to this, right? So prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, Black people in the North, um, and escaped enslaved people were not able to serve in the ranks of the Union Army. That changes as of January of 1863. In the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people seeking freedom fled the South in increasingly large numbers, right? You know, enslaved folks had started to try to run away as soon as the war starts, but the Emancipation Proclamation and this kind of official declaration that the North now fights for slavery, for freedom for enslaved peoples, greatly increases the number of enslaved people who are running away and trying to make it to the Union line. In running away, enslaved people not only deprive the South of their labor which is vital to the Southern war effort, but many of them after 1863 then join the Union Army and pick up arms against their former masters, right? And relatively shortly thereafter, the North is actively recruiting both so-called free Blacks, Black people who live in the North, as well as those who have run away from the South and say, you know what, um, pick up a gun and help us march south. 200,000 African Americans, essentially all 1/5 of all Black males in the United States, ended up serving in the Union Army by the end of the war. They make up 1/10 of the Union Army, and again, given the kind of length and bloody nature of this struggle, that enlistment is crucial to fleshing out the ranks of the Union armies. Probably the most famous group of African American soldiers is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, um, which is immortalized in the film Glory. If you've seen the movie, you'll know that even within the ranks of the Union Army, Black soldiers were not always treated particularly well. They were made to serve in segregated units, so Black and white soldiers were not allowed to fight side by side. And in these segregated units, Black enlisted men would be under the command of a white officer, right? They were not allowed to have Black officers. They also received lower pay than their white counterparts. So white and Black soldiers doing the same job, taking the same risk, received received differential pay. The men of the 54th Massachusetts chose to protest this in a kind of unique way. They refused to accept their pay at all until the pay rates were equalized. They said, we will not even accept pay until you equalize these pay rates. And that was so embarrassing to the union that they actually agreed, and they gave in and agreed to the equalized pay rates for white and black soldiers. Despite the challenges that they faced, even within the ranks of the Union Army, military service during the Civil War became a matter of tremendous pride for Black soldiers and for folks like Frederick Douglass, who were prominent spokesmen for civil rights within the Union. One anonymous African American soldier wrote to his local newspaper and declared that although the government declared that it did not want Negroes in this conflict, I look around me and I see hundreds of colored men armed and ready to defend the government at any moment. And such are my feelings that I can say only the fetters have fallen, our bondage is over. Frederick Douglass put it like this: once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters US. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. Right? And traditionally, in many Western societies, there's been a link between armed service and citizenship. And so for many Black Americans, the act of service to them is a kind of down payment on full citizenship, right? Not that you should necessarily need that, not that you should need to serve, to risk your life to be a citizen and to get civil rights. But for many Black Americans, having done that, they say, we will not let our rights be taken away after this. The valuable contributions of former enslaved people to Union victory helps move along the cause of emancipation. On January 1st, 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibiting slavery and all forms of involuntary servitude within the jurisdiction of the United States. It's ratified by December, formally ending America's century-long history of slavery. In fact, though, even before it's ratified, events on the field of battle had put a practical end to slavery. In April of 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Union is preserved, and some 4 million enslaved people are now free. 1 week later, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. I have 1965. No, that's 1865. My bad. Lincoln is essentially the last casualty in America's bloodiest war. The cost of this war is astronomical. Over 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. It is by far the bloodiest war in American history. And yet, in many ways, the story of the Civil War is only beginning with the end of events on the battlefield. The end of the war brings a series of questions. What kind of labor system would replace slavery in the South? What would the rights of the newly freed peoples of the South be? All of these formerly enslaved people. What will become of them? What is their fate? What is to be done with the defeated Confederates, folks who had committed treason against the government of the United States? Who will rule the South, right? Who's going to be in charge in the South following the defeat of the Confederacy? The North had won the war, but who will control the South in the era of the peace? These are the questions that would define an era of our nation's history known as Reconstruction, and that will be the subject of our final 2 lectures next